This is July 25th, 2006. I'm Charles Lundquist. Today we are having an oral history interview with Bob Pace. Bob, thank you for coming. Usually we start out by letting you say a few words about where you spent your youth, where you got educated, and how you got into the space program. Bob, would you care to do that?
I'll be happy to. My full name is Robert Evans Pace, Jr. Of course, everybody knows me as Bob. All my friends and coworkers know me as Bob. I'm a native of Middle Tennessee, Humphreys County, Tennessee, which is just east of the Tennessee River in Middle Tennessee. If you were in Florence, Alabama, and went due north, you'd come to Humphreys County. I went into the Navy at the tail end, well, in 1944, during World War II, and stayed there until the war ended. And that experience afforded me the opportunity of going to college. Otherwise, I would probably be picking cotton or something like that. I went to Tennessee Tech after the war and got a BS in electrical engineering, and was working with TVA in the construction division at building hydro and coal-fired generators. And in 1956, July, we finished a job in Murphy, North Carolina. And one of the people that I knew when working with at TVA knew Herman Libby. And he said, Herman Libby is hiring people at ABMA and at Redstone Arsenal. So since we were ending the project and looking for another project to get into, I came to Huntsville and went out and interviewed. I think it was in May, and received an offer and moved to ABMA in July of 1956 in Launching and Handling Laboratory, which later became Systems Equipment Lab. And that lab was dissolved when KSC was formed, and all of that activity of doing the launch equipment and things like that was transferred to the Kennedy Space Center. In March, shall I just go through sort of a chronology of what happened to me?
To get that
okay, and you
recorded for history.
And you just interrupt however you normally do this. And it's sort of interesting, when that lab was eliminated, the Agena Centaur program was established, which later became titled the Light and Medium Launch Vehicles. And in March of 1960, by the way, this was going to be a NASA office. And so the plans were to form the Marshall Space Flight Center. And in March, I went to the Lockheed plant in Sunnyvale, California, as the NASA representative for the Agena stages. And I went out there on ABMA orders because Marshall was not officially formed yet.
Yeah, so Marshall was one of the last to be added to NASA.
Exactly. And it was officially christened, I guess, as I remember, on June the 1st of 1960.
July 1st, I think.
July the 1st, thank you, which is the time Marshall Space Flight Center was formed and Dr. Von Braun and all the group transferred over. So I spent 2 years out in the NASA, as the NASA representative at Lockheed.
To whom did you report at Marshall during that period?
Hans Huter was the director of the Light and Medium Vehicles Office, which had responsibility for the Agena, which was an upper stage, and the Centaur, which was an upper stage being built by General Dynamics in San Diego. Fred Dewar was the manager of the Agena program, so he was my immediate supervisor. I spent 2 years at Lockheed, and then moved back to Huntsville and spent 1 year then as assistant to Fred Dewar for the Agena program. And NASA decided at that time to transfer the Agena Centaur projects to the Lewis Research Center up in Cleveland, so we transferred all of those functions at that time to Lewis. In February, after we had transferred the Agena program to Lewis, Marshall was creating the micrometeoroid project, which later became named Pegasus, and Dr. Bill Johnson was the scientist and project manager on that. So in February of that year, after we completed that transfer, I was assigned as his assistant project manager and chief engineer. But in the meantime, I had applied for a Sloan Fellowship at MIT and was accepted. So in June of 1963, I left the Pegasus project and went to MIT for 12 months, where I received a Master of Science degree in management at the Sloan School of Management. When I returned, I worked for Lee James, who was the manager of the Saturn 11B program, for about 4 or 5 months as an assistant to him. And then Ed O'Connor came in as or just before he came in actually, the job of executive assistant to the director of industrial operations became open, and I was asked by Hans Huter to fill that position. Hans Huter was deputy director of industrial operations. So I took that job and stayed there and from October of 1964 to May of 1968. In May of 1968, someone asked me if I'd like to go to NASA headquarters and work on the administrator's staff for a while, and it was sort of a dull period, so I accepted that and spent 6 months.
Who was administrator then?
Well, Jim Webb was the administrator when I arrived, and Tom Payne was his deputy. And I stayed there. I went up in May, stayed there 6 months. So I stayed there until just before Mr. Webb left. Mr. Webb, on his birthday in October, or close to his birthday, President Johnson called him over, and when he came back, he said, well, I'm going to retire on my birthday, and Tom Payne's going to become administrator. Well, Johnson recognized that a Democrat wasn't going to get elected president, and he wanted continuity in the NASA administration, and Tom Payne was a Republican and acceptable, so he effected that very smooth transition.
Well, I had never heard that story. That's interesting.
I don't know how well it's publicly known, so...
Probably isn't.
But, you know, President Johnson was a great supporter of the space program, and he didn't want any big political hiccups in the function of the space agency.
Can you say a few words about Webb? I think he was a pretty remarkable man.
Well, he was a very, very astute individual. He knew he wasn't an engineer, but he was a very smart person and knew all of the ins and outs of the Washington scene up there. And he had Well, there were a number of very positive characteristics that he had. One was he had a way of selecting people to work for him that really were good people, very good people. Second, he felt a great obligation to teach the younger people. And there were a number of people up there in what they called the executive secretariat behind the green doors that worked with Mr. Webb and Dr. Payne and the people in the immediate staff. And every time he had a meeting with anyone, he always had a younger person with him in the meeting just for the benefit of educating the person on how you conduct business at that level and that sort of thing. So he was a great person in that respect. And he also, a lot of people may not know this, but he wrote and had others help write books on the management of the moon mission, because he felt that that technique of managing those projects was very important to write down so that management schools and people like that could pass that on to other people. In October of 1968, I returned to Marshall, and the Apollo Applications Program, which became Skylab, was being formed, and Lee Ballou became the program manager of that. And I went to work in that project, working in the integration and engineering office. George Hardy was the chief of that office, and I was his deputy, and stayed there through the Spacelab, the Skylab missions. Did I say Spacelab earlier? If I didn't. Anyway, it was Skylab. It's what we're talking about here. We went through all of the engineering and design and those things for the hardware, and then during the operations, I was in George Hardy and I were at Mission Operations Center in Houston when the Skylab 1 was launched and the catastrophe occurred. And of course we were sitting there all down in the dumps and woe is us. And I remember one of the experienced operations folks from JSC came by and said, "Come on guys," said, "we're going to make something out of this mission yet." Said, it's not all lost. And he was exactly right. They had all that experience at JSC about how you cope with those kind of problems and still make a mission out of it.
Yeah.
And of course it turned out to be quite successful with Marshall, of course, was instrumental in getting the things done that had to be done to recover the Skylab and have it available as a laboratory. During the Skylab 2 and Skylab 3, which is the first two manned missions, I was at JSC in the operations support for those two missions. And then for the last one, I came back to Marshall and was responsible for the operations support from Marshall to the last mission. After Skylab was over, we at Marshall went through that tremendous reorganization. Patron was there, and he came in, of course, before Skylab flew.
Before you leave Skylab,
yeah,
Skylab was a project that had the wisdom to plan for good documentation of results and so forth after it was finished. And I think you were involved in some of that. Maybe you did one of the books, didn't you?
Yes, I did. It was well documented, extremely well documented, and you, of course, were responsible for one or more of the books on the scientific results of that. The book that I worked on I think John Goodrum, who had retired by now, was the guy that was actually getting it published once we gave him all the material to put in there. But Lee Ballou asked me if I would take the lead in doing a book on the basic laboratory itself, and the title, I think, is accurate in that it's Skylab, Our First Space Station, I believe is the title that we ended up on that. And it and the other in that series of books do exactly what you just said. They do an excellent job of documenting Skylab, what it was all about, and how it was accomplished and the results. It was very good.
In addition to those books, the project office that you were in sponsored a series of seminars among the solar investigators, and that resulted in another set of books that were the Bible of what was known about the sun for many years after Skylab. And again, a very wise move on the part of the management.
Well, the Skylab, the science results of the Skylab, the overall Skylab program, were just remarkable, and did a lot of things like you talked about. Shall I go on?
Go on. But
yeah.
I didn't want to leave Skylab without pointing out how valuable it was as far as documentation and recording it.
Yeah, it was a great program to be associated with, and I think it's just extremely remarkable that NASA was able to survive the failure that occurred on the liftoff of getting the laboratory up there, get it repaired, get it functional, and then make a tremendous set of missions out of it, and then had to abandon it at the end. You know, I was there in the Mission Control Center with Gene Kranz when he turned the switch, pushed the button to turn the power off in the thing, and you know, Gene is an old fighter pilot and a tough he was Air Force, but tough Marine-looking guy, and he probably wouldn't want me to say this, but I saw him shed a tear when he had to push the button, you know, to kill it, because a number of us had invested a great part of our lives by that time on the thing.
Again, before we leave Skylab, the student experiment program was remarkable. Can you say a few words about it?
Well, I wasn't directly involved in the development of those experiments, but
certainly were in the implementation.
It was the idea, and I don't know who was responsible for the initial idea, but George Miller had a lot of foresight that got implemented. And well, it was his idea first place just to have the mission, you know, to have the program. But then he brought a great number of diverse experiments into the missions, and someone thought to bring the students in, which was a great idea because it stimulated not only thoughts about what you could do up there at the student level, but it, I'm sure, motivated a lot of students to become more and more interested in space and directed their future and their profession in that direction. Very remarkable.
All right, well, let's go on after Skylab.
Okay. Well, after Skylab, Marshall went through a major reorganization. Various laboratories were restructured or reoriented, and a laboratory called Materials and Processes Laboratory was established. Up until that time, a materials division existed in the astronautics laboratory, and manufacturing laboratory was a separate lab, and those functions were combined into the Materials and Processes Laboratory, and Bob Swinghammer was selected as the director of the laboratory, and I was selected as his deputy. And I stayed there actually almost 2 years. So that was started in September of 1974, and I left there in May of 1976. And the reason I left, the use of Spacelab was beginning to, the planning for the use of Spacelab was beginning to come along.
Apollo Soyuz program fell in that, along in that period too, didn't it?
Pardon me?
The Apollo Soyuz program.
It was, yes. It was flown during that 2-year period because we had some experiments
on board.
On board, and we had a separation of cells. I can't remember the exact time.
Electrophoresis.
Yes. A brilliant young guy was in the laboratory at that time, and he was the PI for the electrophoresis experiment. So the hardware was developed in that in the Materials and Processing Lab. On Spacelab, the NASA and the European Space Agency, of course, had entered into an agreement for the development of Spacelab by the European Space Agency, delivering it to NASA, who would in turn fly it. And the compensation, so to speak, to the European Space Agency, other than just the experience of doing something in space, was they flew 1/2 of the first scientific payload on the first Spacelab mission. And I was selected to be the mission manager for the first Spacelab mission and work with the Europeans in putting together an integrated payload for that mission.
If I remember correctly, that was a monumental task given the number of experiments that were on board.
It was a huge task, a very interesting task, very challenging, and but enjoyable in accomplishing it. It also brought into project management more of a diplomatic function than we're normally accustomed to, because we were now interfacing with another European Space Agency, and where we would normally work with each other or with our contractors, it's a little bit different when you have to interface with other countries. And each of the 13 member countries did fly one or more experiments on the first Spacelab mission. We had established a principal investigator group. All of the principal investigators would meet and plan how their hardware would be operated during the mission. And
well, that was done during Skylab too, wasn't it?
Not in the same sense,
okay.
Not in the same depth. For example, in Spacelab, it is the first time that a astronaut, so to speak, a payload specialist, was going to be selected from outside the astronaut corps, and it was selected by the Payload Integration Working Group, which was the group that was put together of all the payload, or the principal investigators. And they developed a process and went through the competition and selective process to select payload specialists that flew on the Spacelab missions. And so it was the first time for that. Very, very interesting. And we had meetings of that payload Integration Working Group, this principal investigators, we alternated the meetings between the United States and somewhere in Europe. And it was always a sort of a special feature of a member state of the European Space Agency to host the Principal Investigator Working Group, because it was sort of an accomplishment on their part. Actually, I was only mission manager for Spacelab 1, although I worked directly with the Payload Integration Working Group throughout the period. I became the manager of the OSS Spacelab missions in January of 1977.
OSS being the Office of Space Science.
Yes, a major office at NASA headquarters which sponsored the space science missions, which most of the payloads came out of the Office of Space Science at NASA headquarters. During that period, pat myself a little bit here, on July 13th, 1979, I became a member of the Senior Executive Service, which President Carter established as a way of motivating people to make careers and continue into the civil service program. And in September of 1981, I retired. The center was going through or facing a reduction in force, and that was going to take place in the fall, as I recall, of 1981. I was close to 55 and had planned to retire at 55, so I took an early out to keep someone from getting a letter of dismissal. As it turns out, there were more of us that decided to retire than was needed, so as I recall, they didn't really have to issue letters to anyone, but I did. And I was a consultant to people in the space arena for a couple of 3 years.
Let me ask about one specific thing there that I remember.
Yeah.
I seem to recall that you did a study after you retired of the relative merits of contracting with the PI to be responsible for experiment hardware, or letting the PI only give requirements and then asking some aerospace company to do the hardware. I think that was an interesting study. Would you care to comment on it?
Well, that's always an interesting issue, and that is, how rigid should the requirements be for someone to fly on, say, something like Skylab or Spacelab or even the shuttle, and how much should the PI just bring it and put it on board, or take it on board, which he could do since we were flying payload specialists. During the Spacelab program, the administrator, whose name escapes me at the moment, came to the center for one of his meetings, and I had to brief him on the Spacelab and how we go about selecting experiments, integrating them, what the requirements are, et cetera, et cetera. And in spite of Harold Glazier's up front saying, well, we're just going to tell the PI, here's what you have, bring your stuff, here's what you need to do when you build your hardware, and we'll just accept your Boy Scouts honor that you've met all the requirements. You don't have to send in all that paperwork to show that. Well, that was an ideal objective, but not very practical. And by the time I was briefing Mr. Fletcher, who was the administrator, and I was telling him, you know, well, the PI has to show up at the Cape 12 months ahead of the flights, you know, and he's got to bring all this paperwork with him. And Mr. Fletcher said, wait a minute, I don't like that. Said, I just want him to write on the back of an envelope what his requirements are, and you bring it down and you put it in and you lift off the next day on the thing, you know, which again was Harold Glacier's basic approach. But there are, when you're integrating 80 pieces of experimental hardware, and they all have to meet certain safety requirements, and they have to be compatible with plugging into each other, not only for the functional part, but from a weight standpoint, and not doing detrimental effects to another experiment. It's a little more complicated than just somebody bringing in a Petri dish and warming it over a Bunsen burner, you know, and stirring it up. And you can do that for that kind of an experiment, but you can't if it really gets physically, electrically, environmentally, and requires certain attitudes of the vehicle and certain inertias to be minimized and things like that. It gets a little more complicated. Did I address your...
Well, as I remember...
I didn't address the study as much as you...
didn't address the study, and maybe...
I don't remember the exact results of the study, but as I recall, the principal objective was to try to minimize the documentation that the principal investigator had to deliver along with his hardware.
Also, there was the question whether it was more efficient to let the principal investigator contract for the hardware and make whatever changes he needed to that he understood, versus getting an aerospace company working for NASA
to do it. Yeah. Well, obviously, I don't remember. Yeah, and we've tried it both ways.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we could cite one example and say, see there, that's the way to do it. It's a function of people and how well they communicate and that sort of thing. And some PIs don't have the staff, you know, to manage a contract and those kind of things.
Yeah.
Meet all the contractual requirements that the NASA contracting system would impose on them. So it's a function.
Well, go on with your post-retirement.
Well, in the post-retirement area in 1984, Jack Wade and I formed Pace and Wade Incorporated, and we started out primarily as a job shop kind of activity where we would identify retired engineers from Marshall and make those available to contractors or directly back to Marshall where particular skills were needed. And it wasn't, you know, long-term kind of things. People would work 3 months or maybe work 2 days a week for 6 months or whatever. And then we made a mistake of bidding on a contract and winning it. And
yes.
And the whole tenure of our activity changed drastically, and we became full-time employees of Pace and Wade. And we're successful with work at Marshall and some with the Army at Redstone. We ended up with probably a high of 170 employees or something like that. We had a ground rule that said that it always had to be fun or we weren't going to stay with it, you know, because that's what it was all about. But we continued with that until April the 1st of 2003 when we sold the company to Colsa, a local company which had about the same attitude as we did towards the customer, doing a good job, towards their employees, taking care of their employees, and that sort of thing. So we were quite pleased that Colsa was interested. We wanted to make sure our employees continued to work. We didn't want to get into a situation like this genetics outfit on the South Parkways where they sold out, 3 months later or so, the building is vacant and
Yeah.
all the employees are gone. So it worked out quite well. And we were really ready for retirement because I was 76 years old at the time, and it was time to retire a second time. Well, that about covers me from
Go ahead.
Humphreys County to now.
What advice do you have for the young folks that are now trying to do some of the similar things to what you and your colleagues did during your career?
Oh, you mean as far as where to go to work, or?
Well, and how to get on with going to the moon again, for instance.
Oh boy! Now that's a loaded question on that. How to get on with going to the moon? My advice to I'd like to back up and talk to the younger people that are in school. It's extremely frustrating to me to see these young people, even in high school, that aren't doing well simply because they aren't motivated. They are intelligent, but they don't want to put the effort in to be successful in their studies. And you see them going to summer school to make up courses and stuff like that. To me, that's extremely disappointing and discouraging in some way. But it may be that we've always had that. I just don't know. But my advice is to early on learn how to study, and then ask the question, why does someone want me to take this course? What is the purpose of this course? And understand the objective of it so that you can then apply yourself to getting out of the course what the overall objective of the course is.
Any parting remarks you'd like to make? I trust you enjoyed your career and would do it again if you had a chance.
Well, I probably wouldn't change a bit of it. Marshall was one of the greatest places to work, I think, around that anyone could have found. My career there was very enjoyable. I had an excellent relationship with everyone that I worked with and for. So it was a very good experience. I had to make a choice when I became 55 of should I retire or continue, and I decided to retire and didn't anticipate. I was just going to do consulting work, did not anticipate forming a company like Jack and I did. That, after working and spending a career as a civil servant, was quite an eye-opener on how you go about running a company, being an employer, all of the financial considerations, the tax considerations, what you can and can't do without being taxed to death, you know. And so it was a different world completely. Hiring of people, you know, all of those things. Of course, we hired a few people, but, you know, the personnel office did all of the real personnel work, or human resources as it's called today. But I don't regret any of it. It was all very enjoyable. And I appreciate what you and Bob are doing here and recording these sessions. I haven't looked at any of them on the internet. I'll do that, not that because I'm here, but because now that you've got 30, and I didn't realize they were available on the internet.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and
you're welcome.
We'll call that the end then.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bob.